Good morning, all. Today we have this session, special panel um, on geopolitics of a Himalayan river, China, India, and the Brahmaputra. So basically, the conversation that we are going to start is about transboundary rivers, transboundary spaces. So I just wanted to introduce my panel a bit. There is Uttam Kumar Sinha from National Memorial Museum and Library. There is Partha Das from Aranyak in Guwahati. There is Dr. Meera Best from Southeastern University, and there is Ambika Biswanath from Kubernetes Initiative in Bombay. And myself, I am Mirza Zulfikar Rahman. I am also visiting research associate at the Institute of Chinese Studies. Picking up from yesterday, when in the inaugural session, Professor Mohanty was also talking about that we need to have a sense of evidence-based understanding of the Brahmaputra. Like in this context, we also need to have a evidence-based understanding of the Brahmaputra river basin, and rather than base it on speculation. In a sense, so there's a large sense of speculation that is actually happening in terms of. So we also need to have this conversation in order to clear the air and also see how the processes can go towards having a sense of evidence-based understanding, and also a more nuanced understanding of this Sino-Indian relationship over this river. And therefore, the structure of this panel would be that we'll speak one by one in the order that is given in this program. There is a printing mistake in this program where Dr. Meera Best actually gave a revised title, but is not included in the printed booklet. And she will. Her title is Brahmaputra and the Strategic Imageries, Reflections on India-China Relations. So that is the only addition. I would begin by setting the context for the panel, in sense showing some images here. So this first image is actually the mountain, the snow-capped peaks that you see is actually in Tibet, and this picture is taken from Arunachal Pradesh. In eastern Arunachal Pradesh. So I will begin with this picture, which basically gives the geographical kind of the expanse of this the river flowing through Arunachal Pradesh and into Assam, going to Bangladesh, and tributaries joining in from Bhutan and going into the Sundarbans after meeting the Ganga inside Bangladesh. And this picture actually does not have that kind of the nation-state lines that we see in terms of our imagination of political boundaries in this region. While this map here shows the political boundaries very clearly in terms of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the importance of the Tibetan Plateau in terms of how many transboundary rivers start from there. And one being the Brahmaputra, the Yalung Sangpo Brahmaputra that we are discussing today. This again is a picture of Arunachal Pradesh. There are Chinese dams being built in China. We are also building our own set of dams, hydroelectric projects in Arunachal Pradesh. And so basically the whole point again is that a large section of the territory in this Brahmaputra river basin is also part of the Sino-Indian boundary dispute, as this map would also show. And also there is this kind of a large construction of this is a picture from the streets of Guwahati in Assam, which says "Save Brahmaputra from Chinese conspiracy." And this is this kind of a national security mindset that is actually being pushed locally in the region. And also the importance of actually building water infrastructures on the river to actually have a claim over it. The region has now been projected as India's land of the rising hydropower, in a sense, from Arunachal Pradesh being India's own land of the rising sun. and the big dams such as these, the Lower Subansiri Hydroelectric Project, and also other smaller dam projects which are scattered around in Arunachal Pradesh. And this is the picture of the river Siang, which moves in from Arunachal Pradesh. The Yalong Sangpo enters Arunachal Pradesh and is known as the Siang. And starting from this river, a year back, there was a lot of speculation about the muddying of the rivers, waters of the river Siang. And there was a lot of speculation that there was a lot of construction happening upstream, and there was people almost seeing cement in the river water, and samples were being tested for infrastructure material flowing down the river. And this basically also shows how we are actually speculating on the river without having a solid base of scientific information. And also, we, as of now, only have kind of a memorandum of understanding on transfer of hydrological data from China to India and an expert level mechanism. But in spite of that, there is also a lot of speculation that is happening around the river. And that also, going into this context, and I'll actually also flow into my presentation that begins with my presentation on sub-regional cooperation prospects and challenges on this river, in this sense that when we talk about this kind of a notion, we understand these transboundary spaces and borders as very fixed drawn lines on maps, and as Agnew says, is as the territorial trap. And this notion of fixity is almost viewed as natural formations in our minds and not very artificial. What basically would the geographical features like transboundary rivers would actually be natural formations in the real sense, but we actually see territorial borders as natural formations almost. And that also leads to this concept of this bordered power containers. And my emphasis is now to look at these transboundary spaces and flows of rivers as opposed to the fixities of these territorial bordered lines of these nation states. The contiguity of transboundary spaces and its flows being natural in a larger physical and geographical context, and transboundary rivers are excellent examples of these flows versus fixed notion of territoriality and nation borders. And we have in this region a lot of vulnerabilities and interdependencies in transboundary spaces, and they are in political, social, economic, and ecological in nature. But what we see, the amount of cooperation that in this region is more or less laced by a narrow view of hydropower development, inland water navigation, and it's a very limited view, where also coming in from this kind of a understanding of fulfilling our energy security, and also China's growing influence in South Asia is also making India prioritize sub-regional cooperation initiatives in some way, particularly given that China is also investing in water infrastructures in Nepal and in Bangladesh. And also in that sense, a comprehensive understanding on research on the ecological, economic, political benefits of cooperation on transboundary water issues across these sectors at the national and the regional level will definitely result in addressing some of these vulnerabilities and that are social, political, economic, and ecological in nature, and also result in catalytic benefits beyond the river in terms of providing coherence and convergence in larger regional initiatives. I actually bring in this concept of river regionalism in this context of the Brahmaputra, which basically borrowing from Christopher Tan's definition of political regionalism and referring to these integral formations of transnational government and policy networks, the expression of shared political, economic, and development interests in the region among the basin riparians, stakeholders, and advancement in policy coordination and policy enterprises, and the creation of a regional level institutions to manage the common river basin interest. And in this sense, I also invoke the Southeast Asian river, which is the Mekong. The Mekong, in the case of the Mekong, we always refer to something called the Mekong spirit. So can we also have this sense of a Brahmaputra spirit among the basin countries of China, India, Bhutan and Bangladesh? Because at the end of the day, we are all bound in this larger ecological interdependency in this transboundary space, which is also critical to the larger understanding of the Himalayas. In the race to basically have hydropower development in this region, both China and India are actually causing a lot of threat to the Himalayas itself, the larger space of the Himalayas. So we also have to look at beyond this limited understanding of development to a much more larger understanding of how we can actually cooperate on this in the region. So just to understand this, I basically try to look at a larger issue, the linkages to agriculture, livelihood, ecology, biodiversity, wetlands connectivity, pollution concerns. This has not been seen in the larger cooperative framework, and that needs to happen in this. So I'm trying to quote Professor Patricia Oberoi and Ambassador Kishan Rana's book from which actually points out that the instances of transboundary environmental and human security challenges in South Asia needs to be tackled within the framework of sub-regional interests. They make this point that we need to tackle this within the framework of sub-regional initiatives such as the BCIM, the BBIN, the BIMSTEC and the SASEC, for example, and taking due cognizance of transboundary rivers as what they call as regional public goods, which basically needs to be conserved in a sustainable manner. Some examples in the region are the Kerala Sacred Landscape Conservation and Development Initiative, which is led by the ICIMOR, where China, India and Nepal are involved, and looks at the Himalayan landscape and focuses on building institutions, strengthen capacity, long-term environmental monitoring, socio-economic research. This is the mandate, and trying to mainstream sustainable ecosystem management approaches in the larger context of the climate change adaptation and risk. There's other examples such as the Ecosystem for Life, the IUCN, where India and Bangladesh are involved, the Salween Landscape Conservation and Development Initiative, where Myanmar, China and India are involved, and the Brahmaputra Dialogue, where all the four countries of the Brahmaputra River Basin are involved. So coming to my concluding point is that we can look at the Brahmaputra as what is presently today as a speculative river, but we can also look at it as an ecological river which looks at the interconnectedness of the said transboundary Himalayan ecology, promoting an ecology-based understanding and a language for regional cooperation, as an economic river, build upon the existing economic synergies and the entry points for water resources management to the regional cooperation agenda, economic realism connected to benefits sharing, sustainability, climate change, droughts, floods, and adaptation. As a political river, building effective transboundary water governance mechanisms, strengthening federal decision making, basin-wide political interest articulation, and confidence building towards legal water regimes, regional development goals, and also coming from these three types of rivers, as Sadoff and Gray points out, that it could also be a catalytic river. A catalytic river in the sense could actually promote regional water cooperation as a core catalyst to accelerate regional economic development in turn, and optimal benefit sharing, sustainability of the ecology, and trying to use optimal understanding of the regional water infrastructure that is already present, markets and trade. So in that sense, there is a lot of potential in terms of understanding from this, moving away from this limited understanding and going into a somewhat a broader river regionalism kind of a framework for the Brahmaputra River. I will end now and then would invite Dr. Meda Bis to actually, you have 12 minutes. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. The title of my presentation is Brahmaputra and Strategic Imageries, Reflections on India-China Relations. And what I intend to offer you today are, I would say, two specific but also very different strategic imageries which revolve around the Brahmaputra. The first the first strategic imagery that I'm going to talk about is primarily embedding Brahmaputra in the larger geopolitical context or the landscape shaped by India-China relations. And the second imagery, I would say, in contrast, really attempts to liberate Brahmaputra from these geopolitical leanings and foreground it or root it in the discourse on sustainable water governance. Now, both these imageries, I would say, exhibit different ways of knowing and understanding the Brahmaputra. And the reason that I have qualified the word imagery with a prefix strategic is primarily because both these imageries serve a specific political objective. So it really depends on what the vision of India-China relations is. One can in fact pick on any of these imageries. So in the next few minutes, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to offer you two specific propositions based on these imageries. I'm going to qualify them, and then perhaps we can take it further in the Q&A session in case you have any questions. So what is my first proposition? The first proposition which I offer is that there is a low probability of China entering into an agreement with India on Brahmaputra, as any such agreement will militate against the Chinese interest. Now, the reason why I thought of flagging off this proposition right at the outset, because it does not only help me in embedding Brahmaputra in the larger geopolitical context of India-China relations, but it also helps me, I would say, to offer an alternative argument when it really comes to understanding the riparian behavior of China, which is primarily labeled as a water hegemon. Now, I'm not really saying that this kind of an understanding is misleading or it's misplaced, but what I'm emphasizing is that in order to understand the riparian behavior of China, one needs to sort of unravel layers to further our understanding. And I say this because, this whole argument which revolves around China being a hydro-hegemon, to my mind reflects the limits of linear thinking. And what it does that in return, it actually inhibits a very comprehensive understanding of China's behavior towards India, speaking in the strategic context. So what I offer here is to really understand the dialectical mode of thinking while trying to make sense of China's behavior. And the dialectical mode of thinking primarily recognizes the existence of opposites. And I think this comprehensive, holistic outlook is very important in terms of understanding riparian behavior when it comes to our northern neighbor. Now, the best way, I would say, in terms of conveying what Chinese dialectics is about, I would really draw your attention to the cosmological diagram of the yin and the yang. Which essentially means that both the yin, which is the passive force, and the yang, which is the active force, exist because of each other. The principle of yin and yang is also interesting because it is an expression of relationships that exist between opposing but also interpenetrating forces. Both forces complete each other and create conditions for altering one into another. So in other words, what I'm really trying to say is that what Chinese philosophy tells us, that change happens, but change happens in a gradualistic, smooth fashion. And I think the other lesson which we learn from Chinese thinking is that the key lesson is to really create enabling conditions for that change to materialize. So what I really see here is that there is a definite holism in Chinese thinking which must be understood for having proper insights into Chinese strategy, particularly when it comes to its riparian behavior. And now I will really move on to the next step where I'll use some of these ideas and try to give the controversies around Brahmaputra a proper perspective. Now, if you really look at the patterns which have emerged around the Brahmaputra controversy, there are three sort of patterns which I would like to flag off. I think the debate really started around the mid-1990s when there was this whole turn of China moving towards South Asia, and I think that was a significant decade because it really marked a shift in Chinese posture from a more, I would say, a defensive actor to an offensive actor. And in fact, Fravel Trevor has just come up with a book, and he's called China's behavior as that of active defense. And I think this appropriately would capture Chinese behavior when it really comes to some of these issues. Now, the second, I would say, characteristic which really comes out when you look at this Brahmaputra controversy, that from 90s onwards, or perhaps the beginning of the 21st century, China was also trying to really control or consolidate its power in Tibet, and really wanted to transform it into a trading hub. And the third, I would say, characteristic which really comes in is terms of really understanding the economic designs which become clearer, I think, just a few years before, when China really comes out with its 12th five-year plan, which really focused on developing rivers for harnessing hydropower, and Brahmaputra or the Yarlung Sangpo was very much a part of it. Now, as this debate matures, and there have been, I would say, impressions, articulations, views on both sides of the border, both Indians and the Chinese, and I would say there are two sort of broad views which really emerge. So the first view, I would say, really suggests that the Brahmaputra diversion is a distant possibility, given the cost-benefit analysis that these projects involved, and also the climate insecurities which are associated with these projects. Now, there is a second view which I think is also important to note, and it's particularly interesting to me, because it says that the whole Brahmaputra controversy is primarily a tactical move which actually serves a larger purpose. And the primary objective is towards achieving economic development for Tibet in order to opening its market to Southeast Asian exports, and also maintaining political stability along its southern borders. So when we're really talking about the holistic strategy or holism in Chinese strategy, I think we also might as well look at what's really happened, particularly when you look at this tactical standoff between China and India along the Doklam Plateau. Now, to my mind, what China really has been doing is that it has been really trying to consolidate its base along the northwestern border of Bhutan, which puts Bhutan in a very uncomfortable situation, because Bhutan, being a small Himalayan country, is extremely guarded about its territorial sovereignty and integrity. And it also puts India into a very, very difficult situation, particularly when it comes to the lower riparian neighbors, for instance, Bangladesh, which is in fact accusing India of the same claims that India is making vis-a-vis China. So I would say my submission here is that the Brahmaputra controversy needs to be interpreted as a tactic for distraction, which is a leverage really in China's hand. Brahmaputra, therefore, to my mind, is a non-water issue. Particularly when it comes to understanding China's behavior towards it. It is primarily a strategic lever which China has created on India's northern borders, trying to look at the comprehensive holistic perspective there. So I think this has some learning for Indian policymakers. And what I would submit here, that Indian policymakers should realize that rivers in the northeast very consciously should be de-linked from securitization and politicization, and emphasis, I would say, should be more on developing resilience amongst the population, because we know northeast is a flood-prone region. It also lies on a sensitive economic zone. Now let me just move on to my second proposition. My second proposition is that, on the contrary, there is a high probability of China-India water engagement if one broadens and deepens the nature of cooperation. And in order to further this proposition, I argue that perhaps the sustainable water governance framework can be a guiding light for these two countries. And in this backdrop, I would draw your attention to the normative turn in the international water policy context. And the reason, I would say, for examining this normative turn in the international water policy context, which primarily deals with issues around water and sustainable development, and also invoking some other multilateral environmental agreements, is because of the limitations in China's water practices with her other riparian neighbors, when it really comes to, say, Mongolia or Russia or Kazakhstan. So I thought that it will be a good idea to really look at China's riparian posturing when it comes to dealing with water, transboundary waters with the other riparian neighbors, because these really gives us certain patterns as to how does China really look at the water issue. The first thing, significant thing, which really comes out when you're looking at China's engagement with other countries, is that China has followed a one river, one agreement policy. And I think that there is a reason for it. The reason for it is that it helps China evade a very restricted negotiated framework where two issues can be linked to each other in order to create compatible bargains. One major reason also for this strategy is that China shares around 13 of its 14 international rivers, and therefore it doesn't want to link issues across domains. It wants, and therefore it has stuck to this one river, one agreement policy. Another significant point, I think, which when really looks at China's riparian engagements, are the very successful agreements. So to say, it has in fact negotiated with Mongolia, Kazakhstan and Russia. Now, if you look deeper into these negotiations, what you really find that most of these agreements use technical methods such as exchange of information, monitoring water quality, joint scientific research, emergency response cooperation, creation of joint management institutions, and resolution of disputes through consultation. But there is also an interesting fact which really emerges from these agreements. And that, I would say, is that China has recognized limited sovereignty and the no-harm principle when it comes to its transnational rivers. Finally, I would say that another specific sort of feature which comes in is that China has really followed a distributive framework of bargaining where economics has been the main driver for cooperation, and this, in other words, means that issues such as biological diversity and protection of ecological resources is getting compromised. So now coming quickly to rivers which really flow from China to South Asia, I would say that China only uses a small proportion of water supply from the basin, and therefore when it comes to China-South Asia riverine relations, there is not so much a problem with the quantity, but yes, there is a problem with quality of water flowing down. Add to this the very fuzzy, ambiguous water frameworks policies vis-a-vis China, and China has also been in a denial mode when it really comes to its decisions which is being taken upstream. So I would suggest that a good way forward, a good way to move forward is perhaps two specific suggestions which I have to offer here. The first is look at multilateral environmental agreements, which China has, and second is broaden the debate on sustainable development. Now, I emphasize on multilateral environmental agreements because if one really looks at the case of China and Russia, it has made progress because both the countries really resorted to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Ramsar Convention, and I think this is a very good example because it really redefines the river, which is not just restricted to surface water which is flowing in the river, but it also is the biodiversity, the wetlands, the sediments. And I think this ecosystems perspective is specifically important when we want to really look at the rivers flowing in our region. We have also heard about the endangered species, black-necked crane. I think this is an issue which both the countries can take. Now, another focal area which I think both China and India can take is really to look at this whole notion of sustainable development. And why I say this? Because the Chinese interpretation of sustainable development is largely perceived from the lens of economic value it serves. And I think this anthropocentric view privileges human needs and interests, and even when ecological needs are taken into account, it's primarily within the ambit of payment of ecosystem services, which I think is a very different practice vis-a-vis South Asia. So the big question is that can China and India localize SDGs at the bilateral level? Can both countries strike a modus vivendi of sorts to understanding transboundary rivers within a common reference framework? And I would suggest that if you look particularly at SDG goals 5, 6, 17 and 18, I think 16 and 17, they offer a holistic framework and clear policy tool to take issues further. One way is to deepen and broaden the water engagement and really to engage with at multiple levels, track 1, track 1.5, track 2. And I think this is very, very important because it's important to identify collaborative partnerships. China has been doing on SDGs. I think we really need to learn some of those lessons. Thus, to my mind, and as I've argued it, and I've argued this elsewhere also, a water plus approach, is needed so that we can learn from each other and help translate the second imagery into the policy corridors. And therefore, I think I can conclude here that this, to my mind, can really be a definite way for progress in India-China relations when it comes to water issues. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you for your interesting observations. I'd like to go on to now to Dr. Parthajuti Das, who is the Program Head of Water, Climate and Hazards Division at RNN Guwahati. Please.
Hello. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The title of my presentation here is the Brahmaputra River in South Asia, Need of an Adaptive Hydro-Diplomacy for Effective Transboundary Water Cooperation. Now, my presentation is based on my observation and my active involvement in studies and I would say different kind of engagement with civil society as well as scientific community through the track-through initiative for more than last 10 years, and this is my observation in the eye of an environmental scientist. I'm not from the Chinese study community, neither I'm from social science community. I'm an environmental scientist looking at the whole Brahmaputra issue from a downstream perspective. So I think you are aware that what makes people in Northeast India concerned about China there are 3 or 4 important issues. Number one, China doesn't recognize Arunachal Pradesh to be a part of India. Rather, it says that it's a part of southern Tibet. And Arunachal Pradesh is the core Himalayan zone of our region, and it has the highest water resources potential as well as the hydropower potential. In fact, the most strategic location that China is eyeing at, the Great Brahmaputra Gorge around the Namche Peak, which is not far from, very near from the China Arunachal Pradesh, China-Indian boundary, which is Arunachal Pradesh, is is a very strategic position from Chinese point of view as well as from Indian point of view. So that is a concern. Number 2, the so-called dams that are being built on the mainstream of the Yarlung Shangpo. And China used to deny construction of such dams till 2012 and 13, although the first dam at Jiangmu was started as back as 2010. The third one is the mythical story of diversion of the Brahmaputra, about which much has been said, much has been talked about. These 3 are main concerns in Northeast India as well as in Bangladesh because of their enormous probable potential of impact, detrimental impact on people's lives, livelihoods and landscapes. But in this presentation, I would like to bring your attention to some new geophysical realities which are also important to be attended to. And I think that, and I argue that there is no other way than for collaboration and cooperation between India, China, Bhutan, Bangladesh, the 4 appropriate countries, through which overall understanding and knowledge about the physicality as well as the socio-economic spheres of the whole basin has to be increased, and this has to be facilitated by improved and better diplomatic policy. Now to elucidate what I want to say, I will give you 3-4 examples. Number 1, it was probably June 11 or 12 in the year 2000. Many of you are aware that a catastrophic flooding event happened in eastern Arunachal Pradesh and the eastern part of Assam, and it came like a bolt from the blue. People didn't have any clue where from it was triggered. They only saw water waves coming down the Xiang River, which were as high as from 10 to 15 feet. So they just had to bear the brunt of it. They had no idea about why it is happening, why it was happening, and it was one of the most catastrophic flash floods that has ever happened in that landscape. Right? And there are now few studies available which say that there were a lot of damage also in Tibet, lower part of Tibet, but massive loss and damage was experienced in 5 districts of Arunachal Pradesh and 1 district of Assam. The total casualty in Assam was more than 100, but in Arunachal Pradesh. But in Assam, the total loss and damage and human casualty is still unassessed. That was in 2000. Actually, later on it came to be known that there were a group of Chinese scientists who were monitoring the development of a landslide dam in eastern Tibet, and they also expressed the fear that it could burst, it could collapse in a few months, which might cause flood havoc in India and part of Bangladesh. But at that time, there were no official channel for communicating this kind of concerns or scientific information between China and India. So it remained there. It was never known to the Indian authority. That's why we were caught unaware actually. And later on, when this event is now considered as a trigger, which actually initiated very serious thinking on both sides about possible cooperation in hydrological information exchange, so that there can be better flood forecasting and flood warning given to downstream India, and that is really happening now. From 2013 onwards, now China and India is exchanging. China is giving us hydrological data for a part of the rainy season from May to October. But then in 2017, something very interesting happened, which was referred to by Mirza. Suddenly the whole water course in Chiang, which is the mainstream of the Brahmaputra, and in Arunachal Pradesh, and Brahmaputra in Assam, the water color became black to brown. And this situation persisted almost for a month. Again, there was no clue initially why it was happening. Although there were no reported human casualties, a lot of livestock died. For over a month, there were only speculations, and even the state governments of Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, who got the water samples tested everywhere, and gave alert to the people that do not go to the river, do not take your livestock to the river, do not drink the water from the river, do not use the river at all. But they had no clue. No explanation came, no proper scientific explanation came why it was happening like that. But finally, after 1 month, a plausible explanation came, but that too from a non-government source, from two researchers who were engaged in research in a non-government organization. Right? No official statement from China, no official statement from Government of India, which could probably adequately explain why it was happening. But later on, it came to be known that there was a huge earthquake on November 17, 2017, which triggered a series of landslides. And because of this earthquake and landslides, there were a lot of destruction in some settlement areas where there were some infrastructure, some factories, some chemical factories, etc. And that was the source of the whole chemical pollution of the river. But till now, there is no comprehensive, clear-cut statement explaining why it happened, how it happened. Now, between 2000 and 2017, there were long 17 years, and there were a lot of initiatives in diplomatic relationships. But somehow 2017 unfortunately was a dark year, because in the post-Doklam aftermath, China was not giving for that particular year. Till 2017, China was not giving actually hydrological data. So this is another lesson where we need to learn that when there is no proper intervention from governments concerned, there is a lot of speculation in the media, and social media and mainstream media were full of rumors about Chinese interventions. There were international newspapers carrying headlines like China is building a whole long tunnel to divert the Brahmaputra, and this was because of some accident happening in the tunnel. That's why all the chemicals flew down the river, right? So this was in 2017. In 2018 again, in October, there were sudden flood alerts given to the people of Arunachal Pradesh and Assam that another landslide dam is about to collapse in the Tibetan region, and which will severely affect part of Arunachal Pradesh and Assam. Fortunately, this time, in June 2018, China had again started giving hydrological data to India. And as per the MOU existing between China and India, the expert level mechanism also makes, under the expert level mechanism, China is also supposed to give other information during emergencies. Now this happened during the last week of October, and the data service period is from May to October. So there was no binding on China actually to provide data beyond October 15. But China gave a lot of information about what was happening in October, this last week of October and covering also the first week of November. So this was a very positive development at that time, because unless we received so much of information from China, no flood alert could be given to the citizens of Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, and there could be really serious loss and damage, because a lot of people were actually evacuated based on the flood warnings that came from China. Now these three incidents indicate that there are a lot of dynamic changes happening to the landscape in Tibet, both because of natural factors as well as climate change, as well as other anthropogenic intervention, which must come into the domain of cooperation and scientific research between the two countries. Because if we look at, and I think this is a very important point, that climate change is affecting the whole basin very severely. And there are many studies coming up both from China and India, and more studies coming up from US and Europe. The Chinese scientists usually cover the Chinese part of the basin when they talk about hydrological assessment and climate change impact. The Indian scientists usually consider the Indian part of the basin when they are doing so. It is only a few third party agencies and institutions who are located in some US universities, UK universities. They are only giving us some kind of a holistic assessment of what is happening in the basin. Even then, there is a lack of reliability and accuracy in all the climate models that they are developing, and that is why it is very difficult to have accurate assessments of what is happening now to the whole physical landscape of the basin and what could be happening in next 15 to 20 years. This is another indication that the basin countries, especially India and China and Bangladesh, must come together if we want to develop a very good understanding of the climate change impact, the total hydrological situation, and how the whole hydrological regime of the basin is changing. It is only these 3 or 4 countries, including Bhutan, who can, through collaborative engagements, can give us the best knowledge base, best science of the whole basin. Because of very fragmented efforts of all these countries, we are not having a very robust knowledge base of this basin right now. So I think that to enhance collaboration, especially in understanding the whole geophysical situation of the basin, there must be more and more collaborative scientific engagements. There must be more understanding, more exchange of scientists among these countries, and there must be more exchange of scientific literature. Unfortunately, the richer part of literature, hydrological literature and geophysical literature about the Brahmaputra, which exists in China, is written in the Chinese language, which is not available to us, and that is a big constraint for us to develop in the way of developing a holistic understanding of the river. I hope, through a collaborative approach to scientific expedition and scientific knowledge generation, where probably this group of China scholars can also help by facilitating translation and interpretation of important hydrological literature into different kind of languages, Indian languages, and as well as English and Chinese languages. The whole cause can be promoted. And to be able to achieve a situation like this, we have to rise above the conventional, parochial and narrow focused approach to hydrodiplomacy, because right now hydrodiplomacy is considering only very few narrow focused issues like water sharing, hydrological data exchange for a part of the year, which actually should extend over the whole year. Now there are many more areas like the whole geophysical landscape, the climate change impact, and as my previous speaker has said, the whole impact on ecosystems, wetlands, flora, fauna, all these aspects can be a part of knowledge cooperation, as well as, and this can be facilitated by what I call adaptive hydrodiplomacy, smart hydrodiplomacy, which is futuristic in vision and which takes care of the changes that's happening all around, both in the socio-economic sphere and also in the geophysical sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Baru. Thank you for your remarks. I'll straight away go to Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha, a senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's very difficult to speak on the Brahmaputra, the mighty Brahmaputra, with all its dimensions in 10 minutes. But the key word of my talk is de-emphasize. I think I'll stick to that element. The discussion has largely been on the emphasis of China, which obviously you cannot escape. The sheer fact that China is a supreme hydro-hegemon, the sheer fact that China has a certain historical, certain legacy evolution and how it has intervened on the rivers, and how its political leadership value that intervention on the rivers, both in terms of its own internal development, but also in terms of its external leverages that it can apply. Now, why China is a supreme hydro-hegemon, and often the fact is missed, because from a strategic perspective, we tend to play the more political line of the rivers, forgetting the facts that define, the hydrological facts that should define the river equations. Now, why China is supreme in terms of its water dominance is the fact that from China's territory, you receive about almost 730 BCM of water annually to the other 13 countries and 3 neighboring countries. And China only receives 1% of that 730 BCM of water. So you can well imagine, because China gives water to its nearer peripheral countries, it assumes a larger significance in the political atmosphere of the region. But my awkward statement here is that actually the world is moving more towards being a lower riparian than being an up riparian and down riparian situation. Why? Because we've seen often that even an upstream country, like India is with Pakistan and like China is with many of its countries, is that even if you have intentional plans, for example, to flood, and that's what often has been, the line about upstream and downstream is that the great potential of upstream countries to flood the downstream countries. Now, if you start flooding downstream countries, you have to flood your own downstream region. So it doesn't really work. So often in the political sphere of hydro relationship, there is larger misperception and half-baked truth that defines what the situation is in between two countries. There's a very important literature which I think as students you all should read, and it's the Imperial Gazetteer of India 1909, and it's a good way to go back to see what and how it defined the region. And it beautifully, in a very poetic way, describes the Brahmaputra, which you've shown the slides through. But it also outlines a very significant aspect of the Brahmaputra. By stating that it's no one's river really. Assam can claim it as Baba Brahmaputra, Arunachal can claim it as the Sihang, Tibet has Sangpo to claim for, the Chinese in the map say the Yarlo Sangpo, Bangladesh later on calls it the Jamuna. So there is no real claim as such, so it's very international. And the Gazetteer, really outlines this aspect of how significant the Brahmaputra is from the social, political and economic perspective by highlighting Brahmaputra as a highway. Now that's 1909. For the last 4 years, we've been looking at the Brahmaputra from the perspective of waterways, how to really enhance its strength in terms of, the navigation ability and try to link the region through the navigation and the economic benefit that can be derived. So, and that's an interesting way, because the Brahmaputra was always looked at it from a perspective of how to harness this potential. But as Nehru said, we sort of cut off Brahmaputra like the rest of the northeast from the currents of Indian history. And that has largely remained very much even today. We haven't really focused on the northeast, and therefore we lack a focus of attention on the rivers of the northeast. How do we need to channel it? How do we need to derive the benefit of it? How do we link economic prosperity to social stability? And I think over the last 4 years there's been a turnaround. Brahmaputra was the last major river in India that was to be bridged. That just speaks volume of how the way we have looked at Brahmaputra. There's so much of attention that has gone on the Indus and the Ganga basin that we've forgotten the real mighty flows of the Brahmaputra. So I think that is being, in a sense, is corrected. Now China will remain quite superior on the Brahmaputra simply because of its geographical location. And the fact that India receives from the Tibetan watershed. I remember the figure I said, 730 BCM is what China gives overall water to the entire downstream countries. India receives almost 50% of that 730 BCM of water. So that's quite significant. But that doesn't only come from the Brahmaputra. It comes from the other basins, the Indus, the Satluj, and also almost about 45 to 46% of the waters in the Ganga itself comes from Nepal, which eventually comes from Tibet. So I think there's a broad expanse of how the Chinese can, in certain ways, politically determine its relationship with India, but not only on the Brahmaputra, with all the other rivers as well. So India is not one dependent country on the Brahmaputra, but it has a wider dependency on the Tibetan plateau watershed. We know quite clearly that the Chinese do not want any permanent treaty on rivers. They don't like permanency on rivers. They go for what is called more goodwill arrangement in form of memorandum of understandings or technical agreements, etc. They tend to leave these agreements in a very dynamic fashion, goodwill sort of way, and it is shaped by the political dynamics of the time. And I'm not surprised that Chinese were not sending in the hydrological data when Doklam issue was going on, because none of our memorandum of understanding is a permanent agreement with Chinese. It is always in a 5-term year period, which is subjected to review. And therefore the Chinese are quite smart in playing water in the larger political equation with not only India but many of the other countries as well. Irrespective of that, I think, irrespective of the fact that the Chinese are quite supreme on the water, irrespective of the fact that the Chinese are building a series of dams on the Brahmaputra, which are not only run of the river, and the run of the rivers are quite misleading. The run of the river says that you bring the water back to the turbines. But what if you don't bring the water back? It has to flow. So and that's quite misleading, but that's a typical hydropolitical statement that comes out from an upper riparian. We do that similarly with the Pakistanis. So, but we shouldn't be misled by it. The problem is when China starts building storage dams, that then becomes manipulative in nature, or it can be, if so the Chinese desire. And the Zhangmu is of that nature. Not only that it's large, 530 megawatts, but it can, the water that is stored in the dam, which is essentially for mitigating floods and irrigation, can be released if the political situation so demands Chinese to do. But the Chinese will not do it. And I think there's an element of Chinese responsibility that we have to understand. There's an element of China playing a leading role in the region. And I don't think such kind of easy description of China that they will do this and that for India would really work well. I've always felt that there's a larger sense and sensibility that prevails on the water, and we've often talked about water being used as a leverage or an instrument or a political weapon. But I think upper riparians around the world, powerful upper riparians, have showed far more restraint, far more sensibility on the rivers, and a good case is India with Pakistan or India with Bangladesh. And I think similarly, China with India. But I still feel the whole attention that we should pay on China is quite misdirected. I think I'm quite assured that with the existing MOU that India has with China, the hydrological data sharing arrangement. I think that's solid enough for us to look at the concerns that we have. The only problem with that MOU, which needs a bit of a modification, is to have a little more hydrological station nearer the border of China. The 3 hydrological stations that are there are more in the rain shadow part of the Chinese area, which receives anyway very less rain. What happens really is as the river crosses the Himalayan crest and comes to the more precipitation, high precipitation area that is India, it receives far greater precipitation and therefore the Brahmaputra expands and flows. So what is required is the hydrological station Zizua. It's about 320 kilometers away from Tooting, which is our first hydrological measurement point on Arunachal Pradesh. And I think we don't have anything between that 320 kilometers stretch. I think we need to redefine this MOU with the Chinese, and I think it can be quite easily done. It requires a little assessment, a little forcefulness maybe, but it can be done, and we have a hydrological station nearer to the Tooting so that we can measure more the precipitation volume of the Brahmaputra as it comes in. The other de-emphasis that India needs to do is really look at more bilateral arrangements with Bangladesh. Remember, from India to Bangladesh, the entire stretch of Brahmaputra is about 1,200 kilometers. That's a significant stretch that needs to be looked at, need to be dealt with. And therefore, more cooperation, more bilateral approach with Bangladesh could be very useful, I think, on the Brahmaputra, than rather China and India talking about the Brahmaputra. I would rather think about a more trilateral arrangement with Bhutan, Bangladesh and India on the Brahmaputra, specifically looking at navigation ability of that river. Going back to what the 1909 Gazetteer said, Brahmaputra is a highway. Brahmaputra as a waterway has to be looked at considerably with greater attention, more investment and better assessment that we have done earlier. And I think this government seems to be moving in that direction. Money doesn't seem to be in short supply because the World Bank is constantly trying to give its, lending its money to the whole project, and I think that will be a useful component of that. The whole idea, therefore, finally is when we de-emphasize the Brahmaputra, we are actually emphasizing more our sub-regional cooperation, creating more the riverine space that India is entitled to use and entitled to build its relationship with not only Bangladesh but Myanmar, and then connected further into the Southeast Asian countries. There is a useful coalition now called the Delta Coalition. Eventually the water comes and flows into Bangladesh. We also have a large delta. I think India has to think more in terms of lower riparian equation, lower riparian coalition, think more in terms of delta arrangement with the lower riparian countries, and build upon this constituency a useful network which not only results in economic gains but has a more proper and better understanding on how to really manage the rivers. So I think, as Mirza began by saying, we don't really need to look at rivers from a political perspective. We can also use rivers as a catalyst to build a larger sort of knowledge base, a larger platform to create better economic dividends and a better livelihood. Thank you.
Thank you, Uttam. Now we come to a final speaker, Ms. Ambika Biswanath, co-founder and director, Kubernetes Initiative, Mumbai.
Thank you, everyone. I have to say that all the 4 speakers have made my job considerably easier by talking about many of the things that I was going to touch upon. So I'm just going to give a quick snapshot of what everybody said and then connect it to what my remarks are on. But I'd like to thank Uttam especially because he ended on a note that I was going to begin on, and so that's a really great segue. So Mirza talked about depoliticizing the whole issue, and this is something that I've worked on for many years now, is looking at transboundary waters and water diplomacy outside of the security space. So just to give you a quick background about myself, I worked a lot in the Middle East and in Africa on these issues, especially in between Turkey and Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and then on the Nile, and then West Africa and Senegal. So these are some of the examples that I was going to highlight, and Uttam ends by saying about how we can look at different ways in which cooperation can actually be possible. And there are many lessons from around the world that talk about how cooperation is possible in regions that don't necessarily have cooperation either on water or in other spaces. And then water becomes an avenue to create economic cooperation or move forward and then create a better political regional cooperation. Now, that's a very lofty goal, and one is not going there quite so quickly when it comes to India, China, the Brahmaputra, and all the other countries together. But it is possible to look at water as a means to get there. And so I'm going to come back to what Medha said, and she gave two, I thought, very excellent suggestions as to how we can look at this issue. And I'm going to add a third suggestion over here from what she said, was that we look at different examples from around the world of what has worked and what has not worked. So one issue here that everybody brought up was data, right? We have two stations, India and China, that are 320 kilometers apart. I didn't realize they were 320 kilometers, so thank you for that. We have limited standardization on data. What happens when you have limited standardization on data? Somebody gives you, X country gives you data based on methodology that they are using, and Y country is using different methodology. I mean, this is pretty simple. The data doesn't talk to each other, and that's when you come up with a whole host of problems. Where have we seen this best? In the Tigris and Euphrates River, which I worked on. One of the things we tried to do was create standardization between Turkey, Iraq, and Syria on their data management. It went nowhere, to be honest, but it's a project that many people have tried to figure out, because when you have a certain uniformity on this question, then it's easier to say, okay, this is in fact the problem, and then you can come up with solutions. If you have two different problems, then coming up with solutions becomes that much harder. Where has this actually worked? And that's the Mekong. And then Mirza talked about the Mekong spirit. And I won't go into how that worked, because then I'll start talking about data management, and that can sometimes gets a little boring for people. But what the Mekong River countries, the lower Mekong River countries did really successfully was to have standardization on their data collection, methodology, and then how you analyze and assess that data. And then most importantly, on sharing. So it's not just that, okay, one of the countries, so say Thailand, looked at all of the data and said, okay, this is what is existing. Everybody had access to the same kind of data. So when you come up with natural disasters such as floods or even man-made disasters, you know where the source of that problem is, so then you can take steps to move ahead with it. So I think data, when it comes to this region, can really be a stepping stone to moving forward. The Mekong is a great example. I think the Middle East is an example of what not to do and how we can learn from that as well. And then obviously there is a European Framework Directive, which offers some very great systems that one can put into place. Many times when I've traveled in Africa and the Middle East, the argument is that, oh, the Europeans have these really lofty goals and concepts that we can't really employ. And fair enough, sometimes these things do get a bit lofty for countries that are engaged in, don't necessarily have that sense of warm peace, and are in a space of cold peace, let's say. So we look at examples that might be a little bit more relatable. So I always bring in the Mekong as an example. The other example that I like to talk a lot about is the Senegal River Basin, which is in West Africa. Again, an area where I've worked in. Now, data is not something where they started off from, but infrastructure development is also an area that they worked on. In fact, in the 70s, when they set up the Senegal River Basin organization, they started with joint dam building activity. Now this seems very strange to many countries around the world, that we can in fact have joint dams that are both the right and the responsibility of the countries that share the river where the dam is. And we had talked about dams. In fact, everybody brought up dams. And when you think about India, China, and the Brahmaputra, dams is something that comes to mind immediately. Oh, China's building all these dams, we're not going to get any water. Then India's building all these dams, and Bangladesh is not going to get any water. And as Uttam pointed out, it's not, these things become very fantastical. Even Partha pointed out about how it becomes very emotive and an emotional issue. But if you remove all of that outside of it and look at it as a river as a whole, not as parts or sum of parts, but something as a whole, then all of these things are possible. And that's what the countries around the Senegal River Basin did, was that they looked at the river and what the river, they could get out of the river and what it could give each of the riparian countries. And so they built 2 dams over the space of 40 years or so. So it took time, and these things take time. But both these dams, Manantali and the Diama dams, are jointly owned and jointly managed. The financial responsibility is joint, and so the output of everything is joint as well. Now these were countries at that time that didn't have any cooperative mechanism, unlike if you look at some of the positives that have happened in Europe, or for example between, say, the US and Canada. So it is, I mean, one can go into how all of this happened, but the core underlying point here is that the countries that were along the Senegal River Basin, in spite of not having any open diplomatic conversation on several other issues, figured out that this is one thing that they could work on. It takes a lot of political will, yes. It takes a lot of vision from the leaders, which happened in the 70s. And it takes a lot of investment, not only in terms of financial investment, but political investment, because you don't know what's going to happen once your government or your leadership is no longer in existence. So what happens then? You build structures that are not based on your government and your leadership, but transcend your leadership, and that's what they did. The Senegal River Basin Organization, the OMVS, is considered a very good legal document that river basins around the world can study and look at how they can be adapted to your context. We had taken a group of people from the Middle Eastern countries, 6 Middle Eastern countries, to the Senegal Basin to study that basin. And what I think was one of the great things that we did was not just take the academics, the engineers, or the scientists, but we also took the members of parliament, we took the bureaucracy, we took people from the external affairs ministries, the prime minister's office, the president's office. So because at the end of the day, one can come up with amazing scholarship and amazing ideas and innovative approaches, but it is the policymakers that are going to run with it and get something done. So you put all of these groups together and then you sort of see how the conversation can change in some ways. So that is what Senegal invites countries from around the world to come and study their success story, and they're very proud of it. Going further south in Africa is the South African Development Cooperation, the SADC, SADC, and we talked about sustainability over here and creating an enabling environment. And Ashmeda talked about how the Chinese move in a very slow fashion. And I'm not a China scholar, I'm a transboundary water scholar, but I'm fast learning about what's happening in China. And so I thought that was really great, because when she was talking, the thing that immediately came to mind was the Kazakh agreement between China and Kazakhstan. And that took many, many years to put into place. But if you look at that agreement now, it's quite an interesting agreement to study as to how we can then maybe take aspects of that to a sub-regional cooperation in the Brahmaputra. So not between India and China, but in fact that agreement sort of translates a bit into, if you look at it, between India and Nepal, India and Bangladesh. So how we can then create this enabling environment, I think this is quite an interesting example. So coming back to SADC, what the countries that members of the SADC, and there's 16 or 17 of them now, They started cooperation on an economic front and several other aspects, which now in the last 6 years they have introduced a whole water regime into their agreement. And so they are looking at seeing how the trust built on some of these other areas can be translated into then water sharing and water sharing. Now, what they have very clearly and very well, thank you, defined is that water sharing is not just about equal sharing, it's about equitable sharing. It's about how countries can best get out of this basin what their needs are, not just for the present but for the future as well, because you can't create an agreement that looks at only water in the present tense. You have to look at it in the future. So then SADC becomes an interesting another example to study in terms of what we can then get out of to employ in this region. So I have many examples, and I have only now, I'm guessing, 1 minute left. So I'm going to just come back to what everybody was saying, is that and I really like that it was actually a really positive discussion. Sometimes when you talk about India, China and water, it's not always so positive, so I thought that was really great. Is that all of these things that everybody mentioned are possible. There are any number of examples from around the world and within this region for us to learn from. It requires, like I said, political will and vision, but it also requires a lot of push from people sitting in this room and people that we work with, and so I'd like to end also on a positive note to say that if we look at this river in its parts and then as a whole, the likelihood, and not as India, China, Bangladesh, Nepal or Bhutan, but as the Brahmaputra or whatever we want to call it, it is much more likely that something positive will come out of it, as opposed to if we just look at it in a narrow confines of our national borders. So one is hopeful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have time for one round of question and answer discussion. Maybe we can collect a bunch of questions, and then if you want to address it to someone specific, please do so and identify yourself. So can we have any? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I think this is a high point of this conference. And for many reasons, not because we have no China scholar in this panel. And when Avan said she's not a China scholar, I want to say that that's a good thing about this panel, that you really reflected on a very important issue. And I noticed that there is no JGU in this panel. I hope they take interest in the water issue. Any JGU faculty present here? Yes. Now, I feel particularly happy because this is culmination of a 20-year effort of ICS. When we convened in 1999, the first Kunming ICS conference, and we had Northeast scholars, Udayan Mishra, Apurva Barua included, in this conference in IGNCA. We started this process. Now, so my first question is, and BCIM was the product of that process. When you say de-emphasize China and emphasize cooperation with Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and so on, I think they are not exclusive. They are not mutually exclusive. I think the BCIM process is very important. And so that should have this perspective, this holistic perspective. And at the same time, we can also have our regional or sub-regional process. Now, this 20-year process had two stages. One stage led by Patricia Uberoy, Kishan Rana. The other next stage led by Jabin. And thanks to Jabin, now we have this panel. I think Rahman and this group you have put together. And so I'm so happy. Now, two things which you have presented in Brahmaputra should be taken as a catalyst not just out of the security paradigm. In fact, what impressed me most was this discourse takes us away from neorealist security, neoliberal economy, and neoliberal sustainability. There is a green capitalism, that is neoliberal sustainability. And we want creative sustainability, which takes all the challenges of Anthropocene into account. And therefore, the holistic formulation is so important. We have two documents. One you have referred to, the very important book of Kishan Rana Patricia Oberoi. We have a ICS contribution to the economic corridor formulation. The final economic corridor statement doesn't reflect the ICS perspective fully. I think about 20% or so. But if you see the ICS document that we submitted to the economic corridor, BCIM economic corridor preparation, then you will find exactly these dimensions. That how you take up the ecological, economic, local people's, cultural, political, economic, ecological needs, all this. So the holistic perspective. So please take a look at that. But the most important thing in this panel was what Thanchung calls the Himalaya sphere. I think we haven't really taken that concept seriously. It consists of the ecological, cultural, economic, holistic view of the Himalaya system, which defines the ecological, economical, socio-cultural features of all the countries on both sides, on all sides of the Himalayas, including China and South Asia and Myanmar to Afghanistan. That. Now, what is critical about that is that it does take us outside that neorealist security paradigm, and I know the security considerations are not irrelevant, they are important, but what kind of thing will lead to a mutually satisfactory arrangement? Therefore, I will suggest that we consider the Himalaya sphere concept seriously, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Any more questions, please? Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Good afternoon. My name is Parth. I'm a final year student at Srinagar University. I have two questions. The first question is for Medha ma'am. You said that a permanent settled agreement with China is unlikely in the near future. I tend to agree with that position. Could you just elaborate on that in the context of the current politics of both the countries? We have populist leaders on both sides of the borders, and giving concessions on such hot topics is an issue here. And second, upon China's repeated practice of using the conflict in some other space to use it as a bargaining chip for an issue in some other space. So if you could just elaborate on that. And my second question is to Dr. Partha. Sir, regarding the future of hydro diplomacy, do you think that relations could be better managed if we have decentralization of at least some technical decisions? Like I'm thinking of some committee at the local level, cross-border committee, where some decisions are at least, they don't have to run it through Beijing and New Delhi. So if something of that can be achieved, and will it be helpful? Thank you.
Since you dealt with Brahmaputra and it runs from China to India, do you think any similarities in terms of civilization, well, culture, particularly in terms of water culture? Water has its own culture. I was reviewing a book, Sujan's something, and she says water has a very interesting culture. Do you find any similarities across the borders? Thank you.
Yeah, so one question. Okay. One question that came up in my mind when the idea of of a closer data collection point being situated from the Indian side was that if there's a claim to Arunachal Pradesh as a Chinese territory and the Indian side is moving a data collection point, wouldn't that require a concession on the Chinese side that there is some legitimacy to the Indian claim? So that might be bringing a slightly realistic point, a realism perspective to it, but how does one negotiate that as maybe as a policymaker or as a decision maker situated there, where you have to explain to the other side that you have to put that claim aside, but the Indian state does need to move this ahead for the benefit of what it claims are its people, right? So how do you negotiate that contradiction? Because it would require the Chinese to agree that it is an Indian data point, and we will supply information from our side, right? And then again, the idea of a standardization of data comes in, right? They have to agree that both sides differ, and that's why the other side has its own thing, and that's why the other side exists. So that legitimacy isn't conferred to them, because then the whole problem of Arunachal Pradesh as an Indian territory comes in. So how do you negotiate that? How does one go around it, or how does one hedge their bets beyond the Chinese saying, no, it's not a territory, we'll do what we want, so you can't set up some collection point?
Quick responses maybe?
Yeah.
We can take it also to the lifestyle also.
Very quickly on the Himalaya sphere, I think one of the points I forgot to mention was the idea of a Himalaya Scientific Council, which can be thought about in the Himalaya sort of watershed. Remember, China is a non-permanent observer in the Arctic Council. India is equally a non-permanent observer in the Arctic Council. So I think there is this Arctic Council framework. And remember, Arctic Council is not a security strategic council in that sense. It's a council where you bring in a lot of interdisciplinary approaches to examining the climate change impact on various issues, for example, snow, the permafrost, the ice, etc. So I think that there is an institutional example here, and we've been often talking about a Himalayan Council. We have ICIMOD in Kathmandu, which in a sense gathers the knowledge of the region, and there's China also participating, and there's Pakistan also participating here. But the Himalaya sphere breaks the concept of the territoriality of these issues and brings in a more free-flowing knowledge in order to protect the watershed, which is so dependent on many of the issues. On the question of reworking the memorandum of understanding with China, and I think this is something that we have to do really. We can't go by this continuous goodwill approach that China has on us as if they are really helping us out in certain ways. I think we'll have to really sit and talk with them. And I think it's important to emphasize this bit about where to locate the hydrological station. Because if you emphasize on that, we also claim Arunachal as our own, as a zone of concern for us to manage. If you don't do that, if you don't show that concern, obviously, the Arunachal Pradesh itself looks very weak then. In similar way, we have to do our border management far more effectively, bring in more economic development to these regions. And that's where then we can start owning up that region. And therefore, the development of the water becomes critical to that ownership of the territory that India has to emphasize upon. And I think it can. I think India needs to. You see, we cooperate, contest, and compete with China simultaneously. I think this element has to be brought into our water dialogue itself.
I think that was a very important question about decentralization of hydro diplomacy and not. I think decentralization in any other sector, when we come to good governance of water, definitely is an indication of good health. But probably the reality is quite different, because here we where we agree to the fact that in India at least all those issues which are pertaining to shared waters, decision about or discussion about regional rivers or transboundary rivers are usually in the domain of the central government. I mean, that is the norm. And I'm not a legal person, but I would think if you want to reverse it, probably you might bring in some kind of a constitutional amendment. But you must have heard of there are other developments nowadays in transboundary negotiations, which people call track 2 negotiation or track 2 discussion or track 2.5, track 3, etc., which are proving to be very, very useful nowadays all over the world, because this opens the door for a large number of other stakeholders who are interested to intervene. So I think definitely this is a future development that we will see, but I don't know how soon. Thank you.
Meera, you can wish.
Thank you for those questions. To be very quick, I don't have much time, but I'll just tell you about the source of this thinking. And what I was really trying to emphasize, specifically when you're looking at some of these Asian strategies, is that you also look at geographies of thought. And I think that is very important, particularly when we are thinking about Asia really being that space where much of policies are shaping up and much of action is happening. And why this is also important, because if you look at the larger discipline of international relations, there is this broader entry point which I have towards some of these concepts, is much of the IR theories to ethnocentric, and I think it's and therefore the theories of international relations are themselves inspired by Western political thought, which is fine. But I think that you also need to know Asian ways of thinking, and when you look at the Asian ways of thinking, for instance in the case of China, and you understand the concept of power, so there is this concept of power called Shi, and I think engaging how China really understands power becomes very important in terms of understanding patterns which really emerge from the policy space. So that is one. The second point, I think you really talked about, the bargaining framework which I had used, which was essentially distributive bargaining. And so what you essentially do in distributive bargaining, there is a lot of negotiation theory in that. You really try to find or establish a commitment, because once you really establish a commitment, that helps you increase your bargaining power. And again, when you look at China's behavior, riparian behavior, along with not only I would say riparian behavior, even if you look at how it has behaved when it really comes to border issues. It tries to establish its commitment. I'll give you just two simple examples, to make it more understandable. First, when I think negotiations were going on between Kazakhstan and China, there was this whole issue. Now, Kazakh exports a lot of oil to China, and similarly it has a lot of problems with the water, with regards to water allocations. But China has primarily tried to escape this issue of linking these two particular aspects, and therefore we say negotiation theory, we call it restricted negotiation framework. The second example is that, again, because I follow Bhutan, when Bhutan-China negotiations were going on, Bhutan always had this thing with China that, why is it that, because you are becoming so positional about this 264 square kilometers of territory. And there again, China tried to establish its commitment, working within the broader distributive framework. It said, well, we have so many countries, we're sharing borders with so many countries, and if we make a concession here, there will be compromises, we'll set back precedents. So I think, and there is where, if you look at the entire South Asia, and even I think, the way negotiations happen, there are two ways in which you undertake negotiations. One is like primarily a distributive bargaining framework, which are primarily claiming tactics. And the second is primarily more integrative frameworks, which are transformative in nature. And I think when you are really looking at how countries negotiate with each other, what are the issues or what are the alternative ways, those discursive strategies or discursive spaces which can actually transform the nature of debate, is something that I think a student of negotiation needs to look at. And in order to do this, you need to go beyond that very security-centric sort of a paradigm. And I think also look at some of the literature which you had mentioned about, the Himalayan space. What are the ideas? How can the discursive space actually broaden and deepen the nature of agreements? I think that becomes significantly important.
Thank you. Professor Monti, when we walk this title out, we have put Himalaya as a central, as a Himalayan river, describing Brahmaputra as a Himalayan river, and that explains the crux of our focus. I would like to put on record the thanks to Institute of Chinese Studies for putting together this panel, and the Jindal Global University, and otherwise it will not be possible to have this conversation, and hope such conversations will happen more in the future. Thank you.